Here is Huberman's tweet, and he goes, so many questions about seed oils, so here it goes. Folks like Layne have argued quite compellingly that it's a calorie density, not seed oils per se, that is problematic, but there remains a very vocal seed oils are the culprit crowd. Here's what I know for certain. There are a growing number of restaurants and food trucks in LA, NYC, and Austin and elsewhere advertising no refined seed oils, only butter, ghee, tallow, actual olive oil. And I suspect that more will follow suit. Meanwhile, does anyone on X know of any credible and independent lab exploring seed oils in the context of human cellular health and illness? If so, please put it in the comments. Thank you. And so Layne Norton replied, and he had a longer tweet, but interrupt me, guys, if you guys have something to say. But Layne says, seed oils are not innocuous to human health, as they have been the biggest contributor to increased energy intake over the last few decades. However, the idea that they are uniquely harmful isn't supported by hard data. And so Layne says, yes, you can find in vitro studies looking at lipid oxidation and cell damage. Yes, you can find rodent overfeeding studies where there are negative outcomes. Yes, you can find epidemiology showing consumption of seed oils is associated with worse health outcomes. But what happens in human randomized control studies? What happens in RCTs where seed oils are exchanged for saturated fat? Neutral or positive effects on inflammation, neutral or positive effects on heart disease. What about metabolic health? Neutral or improved insulin sensitivity, PUFA decrease visceral fat relative to saturated fat. PUFAs improve HbA1c, fasting glucose C, reactive peptide, HOMA-IR compared to saturated fat. And what about cancer? Replacing saturated fat with PUFA doesn't affect cancer incidence. PUFA decrease risk of cancer mortality slightly compared to saturated fat. Even the most demonized PUFA, linoleic acid, does not increase cancer risk. What is my take here? If you only look at epidemiology and in vitro mechanistic data, you can hack together a horror story for almost any nutrient. I'm RCTs where N6...
I think it's supposed to be in RCTs. There's a number of typos.
In RCTs where N6 PUFAs, aka seed oils, are used in place of saturated fats, they are neutral/positive effects on health. This is crucial. Last one here, or second to last. Because if you are dumping seed oils on your food, you are increasing calories and can incur energy toxicity, aka overfeeding. Further, seed oils are part of many fried foods. These foods are extremely energy dense. Most people overconsume them in calories by default. But when you compare them head to head with saturated fat is not superior for almost any health marker, and for most SFA is worse. But you don't just dump seed oils on everything you eat because you'll likely overeat. And overeating has serious metabolic consequences. Are seed oils uniquely harmful? Not based on the human RCTs comparing PUFAs to other fats, and in many cases, they seem to be better. The only data to the contrary is weak epidemiology or mechanistic studies, now cue ad hominems, false dichotomies, straw mans, and appeals to naturalism. People have been asking me to cover this topic for a while.
That's enough, Danny. I'm going to vomit.
Okay,
I can't do it anymore.
Yeah, we don't need that last slide. It's nothing.
What do you
He
think?
just got more inflammatory in the last couple slides, and just it wasn't the arguments were in the first few that we covered. So,
What do you think, Mike?
I think that completely throwing out the animal studies and then also the in vitro studies and the cellular studies and understanding the mechanisms of how polyunsaturated fatty acids are working, because you have some randomized controlled trials that show some neutral, if not positive effects, at least through associative markers like cholesterol values, is a huge error. I think it's a huge error and then to even frame things as if it's just a calorie problem is kind of a ridiculous argument overall, at least in my perspective. And I think if I'm not super familiar with Layne's work, because I don't follow him or engage with his content or consume his content on a regular basis, but I get the sense that everything for him is calories in, calories out, or some type of perspective or some type of lens through there, which in general, I think is a bit of a laughable lens, because calories tell you nothing about the food content besides some arbitrary marker of energy. So it doesn't really get into the nitty gritty details of what the individual foods are doing metabolically, or how they're interacting with microbiome, or how they're interacting with hormones, or anything along those lines. I think starting to look at the specific effects there becomes quite important, and actually understanding mechanisms becomes important instead of understanding associations or statistical component analysis inside randomized controlled trials. I'm not saying to throw those things out. I'm saying to try to figure out what is marry or kind of find the paradoxes, or eliminate the paradoxes by understanding what's going on metabolically in these certain circumstances. I think that would be the actual intelligent approach overall, instead of saying, oh, there's all this other stuff, you guys don't know what you're talking about because we have randomized controlled trials. You could also pull up trials with polyunsaturated fatty acids, including fish oil, that create problems in terms of lipid peroxidation and things along those lines. So just like throwing study at each other and study is useless. It's like, that's not even worth engaging in that. It's more going into the research. Okay, we have this set of mechanisms. We see that polyunsaturated fatty acids are more likely to be peroxidized. In certain states, they are more likely to increase lipid peroxidation, especially under states of stress. We know that they're metabolized differently than saturated fatty acids in terms of their packaging export at the liver, in terms of their effect on LDL, in terms of their effect on how they're actually oxidized inside the mitochondria because of the double bonds. We know that all of these things have multiple different effects, and it's trying to take this full picture together and understand, why are we seeing these situations inside animals? What is the context that's causing that? Why are we seeing some of these changes inside the human studies? And then marrying those things together with the mechanisms, putting the full picture together, instead of being, oh, randomized trials show this, so we should, like, it's just calories, it's not the seed oils. And everyone else who's showing also their data, like, just ignore them. Data is more important than your feelings or something like. So basically, it's just an appeal to some type of authority perspective, which I think is a useless perspective to have, and more valuable to actually figure out what's going on. So we know there's problems with polyunsaturated fatty acids. There is data to show problems. We also see some studies where we're not seeing problems, or some markers that are looked at for cardiovascular disease, like cholesterol levels, tend to improve, or changes in insulin sensitivity. But those things can be explained by some of the mechanisms of PUFA, and how the polyunsaturated fatty acids are going about inducing those mechanisms is extremely important to understand, because there's things that will have beneficial effects if you're looking at associative factors inside the body, and will show benefit if those are the ways that you are determining benefit, but how it's going about it may not actually be beneficial overall. For example, like, you can lose weight on keto or low carb diets, but in the long term, there may be problems down the road in terms of what's going on metabolically with running on excess fatty acids, and then changes inside the mitochondria. So the question is, again, how are these things happening, and how do we rectify any type of paradoxical arguments and understand what's fully going on, instead of creating a duality of randomized controlled trials are the best and everything else is useless?
What do you think, Jay?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely echo that. I think, so we had a very similar discussion with the Layne Norton piece, where he was basically saying the same thing, where, and again, as you said, Mike, I don't know the details of Layne's views on health as a whole, but from what I understand and what I have seen, it's a calories are all that matters sort of situation. And so these, specific foods, macronutrient ratios, any intervention only matters in so much as it causing consistent calorie deficits versus surpluses. And that is the lens. And so everything else has to fit into that. And there's a huge resistance to the idea that anything outside of that affects health really in any way. And so I think that is his basic stance from what I see. And along with that, it's like a debunking trends, and seed oils have become this trend. And in the process of doing so, the rationale for it has become diluted. Even just calling it seed oils is missing the point, right? It's not even talking omega-6s. It's definitely not talking omega-3s as well. So there's been this huge dilution to the point where it gets to someone like that, or it's become popularized, and the details are going to be missed, and it makes it much easier to discount. And that's a natural progression of things, but it's going to leave room for someone to say, oh, well, there's not enough data on seed oils to say that there's a concern. And as we talked about again in the Layne Norton piece, the whole, like, the big picture idea, and this is something you were getting at, Mike, that if there's not a clear effect across all randomized trials, it's not, there's not enough evidence to do something about it. I think is a really dangerous premise for a number of reasons. Part of this is, the whole reason why research is done, and also it's not just randomized controlled trials, it's randomized controlled trials in humans. And so there's a number of things to note here. For one is that first off, mechanisms are important as a starting place. And then Layne has a point that just because there's a mechanism doesn't mean it plays out in real life in the way that we would expect it to. And that's an important point. Like we don't want to just take a mechanism on its own. We want to then see that play out as we apply it in intervention type research. And the thing is, you see that very clearly across all animal studies. You see it very clearly across big picture theses throughout physiology, looking at something like the membrane pacemaker theory, where you're taking application of mechanism and applying that across all species, across randomized controlled trials in species, looking at epidemiology, looking at the whole thing and seeing very important trends, in this case, showing that the more PUFA that you have in the membrane, the quicker you're going to die and the shorter your lifespan is going to be, and the faster you're going to age and on and on. So these things are really important not to discount unless we have a reason to discount it. So if you're going to say, yes, there's a ton of rat studies and mice studies and animal studies showing increased consumption of PUFA increases lipid peroxidation, causes cardiac issues, shortens lifespan, increases mortality, and on, but there's a very good reason we discount it, and that's because rat physiology in terms of PUFA is dramatically different from humans. Great, that is important, but that doesn't exist. There's nothing to suggest that we should discount that research. It's really important. And there's a lot of value to doing research on animals because it's much easier to create larger interventions across a longer time span and study it more in depth than it is with humans. You can't give you can't do this huge intervention over 50 years with high PUFA versus low PUFA, then kill the human, examine the tissues, look at how long they lived. And there's so many things that you can't do in human research that you can in animal research. So it's really important to consider the animal research unless we have a major reason to discount it. And I would say that the animal research here is extremely clear as a starting point, and that corroborates all of the mechanisms that underlie it. So that's one thing that I would say, is that if we're just looking at randomized controlled human trials, we're missing all of that. Then, as you were saying, Mike, when it comes to randomized human controlled trials or randomized controlled trials in humans, there are quite a few that are suggesting negative outcomes from various, polyunsaturated fat levels of consumption and whatnot. And what we're not going to do in this podcast is dig through hundreds of studies and explain why some are more valuable than others, or some have problems with their methods. And that's not the whole point of this podcast, but I would just let it be known that there is quite a bit of human research that suggests that there's great concern with the polyunsaturated fats.
Yeah, but Layne said, I'm just
what was that?
I said, yeah, but Layne said, I'm just joking.
Well, that's what it's not about. It's not supposed to be like a match between Layne's studies and then the studies that we cite. It's not like Layne says this and we say that. It's like, why are we finding the discrepancies? What are the mechanisms that are leading to the change in the discrepancies? Can we actually figure those out? Because there has to be an explanation for why there's a difference. And some of it could come down to how the studies are done, but some of it can also come down to how these types of fats are being metabolized differently, and then the different contexts in which they're being used, which is important to consider. And I think that's where I would recommend looking into these types of processes and getting the full picture, instead of cutting out one entire area because calories, or because these are randomized control and then everything else is, it's not randomized control. That's gold standard, whatever the thing is.
Well, you had mentioned it earlier. Like, for example, I would bet that Layne would interpret a decrease in cholesterol as a good thing. Which we might look at as like a poisoning the mitochondria or something. And also, I don't even think you have to go that deep with it. Like, if you find a higher level of prostaglandin E2 in breast cancer, or you find higher prostaglandin E2 in prostate cancer, and then PUFA is the substrate for that to be produced, like, that's not that, like, it's not mental gymnastics to try to figure out what's going on there. And so I don't know, if some of this stuff is so low level and it doesn't have to be too complicated. So
you can't do that, Danny. You can't say, well, there's peroxidized polyunsaturated fats in plaque, so if you consume them, that's going to be more likely to happen. You can't do that until we have a clear randomized controlled trial.
Yeah, we need RCT for that.
With no conflicting evidence around it at all.
Yeah.
Everything about has to show very clearly that there are only beneficial outcomes or only harmful outcomes from this. And again, one of the other things we're getting at, sorry, Danny, do you want to keep going? I know I interrupted you.
No, I'm good. Keep going.
Okay. One other thing that we're talking about is there's a number of biases from the mainstream research channels. One is they're looking at certain outcomes like a decrease in cholesterol and assuming that that's going to improve heart disease risk, let's say. And there are a ton of built-in assumptions there that are really faulty. So that's one thing to consider. The other is the general bias in research is one for things like calories in, calories out to be the only arbiter of health, right? There is a huge industry bias for that. That's majorly beneficial to industry, and either that or genetics, right? Those have to be the two things because that leaves the food industry off the hook, and then it allows the pharmaceutical industry to function. And so that is a huge inherent bias across research, across medicine. Another thing to consider as well is with the seed oils in particular, you could argue that there are particular, I mean, you see it labeled, right? You see heart healthy labeled on all, on the canola oil and everything. There's a huge government bias to it, and there has been for a very long time. I mean, we're talking 50 plus years. There's a huge industry bias. So that is going to be a huge influence when it comes to the human randomized control trials. And it's hard to quantify that. And I'm not saying just throw out all the trials because of that, but I do think it should be considered for sure. And then the last thing I would say is, again, that's going to affect the way that the study is set up, right? And you can set up, like Mike, you've talked about this a lot with medications. It's like you test the new medication against a suboptimal dose of the old one that's too low to have an effect. And you say, hey, look, the new medication works way better. They set up the trial for a certain outcome. And that kind of thing happens with the polyunsaturated fats as well, where the low PUFA group is not really all that low in many cases. And it needs to be pretty low. If you're at 10% and the other one's at 20%, you're not going to see enough benefits at 10% to really see a difference there. So again, it would require picking apart particular studies and comparing it with others. And that's not what this podcast is for. But those are all just general considerations that I would take into account.
Yeah, it's probably beyond the scope of this conversation, but Michael Polanyi has a book called Science and Society. And the point of the book is that there's no such thing as value-free science. And at any experiment, like the scientist is making 1,000 kind of personal choices during the whole thing. And so, and that's like something that's a big problem in our culture. But
you can read when you read the papers, you can see the biases, you can see the perspective, and you can see the logical progression through the thought process on how, and it's not that the researcher is like, oh yeah, I can't wait to see this PUFA do well. But it's if you're ingrained and encultured in a thought process that the polyunsaturated fatty acids are beneficial for heart health because they lower cholesterol, they increase membrane fluidity, or these types of mechanisms. And then the mechanisms that they are precursors to eicosanoids or inflammatory mediators, that they are very susceptible to lipid peroxidation, and incorporating that into the cell structure may be problematic, or even familiar with like the membrane pacemaker theory types of ideas with the changes in polyunsaturated content inside mitochondrial membranes. If that's not even in your awareness, and your whole education process is around awareness of the benefits on cholesterol or the membrane fluidity, or that they're essential or things like that, those ideas take precedence inside the papers. And when you start reading the papers, a lot of times papers will start off the essential fatty acids discovered by the Burrs and yada, yada, yada. And like that is telling you that this is the premise, this is the frame with which this person is looking at this entire paper and the research. And like, that doesn't mean that everything that they're doing is consciously biased in the sense that they are trying to shoot for an outcome that favors polyunsaturated fatty acids, but it because that exists in and of itself. And, it may be hard if you don't know about these things, like how you're going to get rid of that. You don't know what you don't know. Right. So but because those things exist, when you start reading the papers, you can kind of see like the way the thought process unfolds and the way that the logical progression and how the experiments are set up are done. And especially because even inside the research, like the idea that lard is a high saturated fat substrate for the diet is laughable. It's not a high saturated fat substrate by percentage of fats. So like, again, that's just one example. That's not specific to something that Layne said, but when you go through some of these studies, what you start to see is that they'll say the low PUFA group and then the high PUFA group, and then it'll be lard, or it'll be like this plus corn oil or something to prevent an essential fatty acid deficiency. And so in that circumstance, like and some of these things, you're not really testing low or high PUFA. You're not really testing high saturated fat versus a high PUFA intake in certain circumstances. A lot of times you're just testing some amount of PUFA versus some other amount of PUFA, something along those lines. And then again, the other mechanisms aren't considered, right? And that's what you're kind of touching on, Danny, is that if there's a context that polyunsaturated fats are good because they lower cholesterol, but then this is why understanding mechanism is so important, because if you know how they're going about lowering cholesterol. So Jay and I talked about this in the fatty liver series. If you see with like fish oil, that fish oil is going in and creating oxidative stress in the endoplasmic reticulum of the cell, and then affecting the ability of the liver cell to actually export the LDL, and then you're lowering serum cholesterol. Yeah, but how are you going about doing that? That's highly problematic. Even with something like statin, the idea of statins, we're just going to block the whole, the melavinate pathway through the HMG CoA enzyme. We'll just block the whole thing, and then your serum cholesterol levels will be lower. But it's like you haven't corrected any of the underlying problems as to why the cholesterol levels are elevated in the first place. And then consideration for the problems of the downstream effects of that because of the use of those metabolites through that pathway in different areas. For example, with the deiodinase enzymes or proteins inside the mitochondria, like there's no thought to that. It's just like cholesterol bad, we're going to lower it. Therefore, any outcome after that, it has assumed to be good on cardiovascular function without really digging in. So how the papers are being formed and how things are being thought about have implicit biases in them, not conscious biases, but subconscious biases. And then the papers are being driven in these types of directions. So like, again, there's like a million examples I can give, right? Like you see increased insulin sensitivity with polyunsaturated fatty acid consumption. It's like, yes, that is probably going to happen because the polyunsaturated fatty acids don't change the FADH to NADH ratio as much as the saturated fatty acids do because they have double bonds. But that's in a short term. That's not talking about what is the long-term effect of incorporating polyunsaturated fatty acids into the structure or lipid peroxidation or the inflammatory mediator. So context is also really important, and so are mechanisms. And that's why you have the randomized control trial, you have the human data, you see what's going on there, you see what's going on in these different mechanistic studies, and then you break down and you try to understand, well, why are we seeing this here? How can we put the mechanisms to understand these different studies instead of just, well, the researchers' results were X, and then, okay, so then it must be good, and it's just calories. Like, no, it's just calories. And the calories thing is the worst because, again, like, what does a calorie tell you about a food? It tells you some fungible, quantifiable value of energy. That's it. That's literally it. It's like you're trying to use a really blunt tool. You're trying to use just a hammer to build a house. And that's all the calories are good for, hammering in nails. And then you want to explain everything through the hammer instead of all the other things downstream besides that. And that's why you have categorization of macronutrients, micronutrients, the heavy metal contents of food, polyunsaturated contents of food. Like there's multiple things to look at in terms of the effects of these things on the body. And I think that's more important to consider instead of some blanket statement about calories, which again is even unhelpful to people. Besides the fact that if you want to know how much food you're eating, you can quantify it in calories. Like, yes, if you overfeed certain things, there's problems, but there's more to the problem. There's more to the problem than just that. And just focusing on that is doing a disservice to many people who are trying to solve their problems and like looking to see what are these other things. And that's why for me, it's irritating when it goes to that, because it's like an apology for what's going on with the food industries and things people are exposed to. It's like, oh, you're just a glutton. You're just eating too many calories, when it's like, no, the food supply is like really damaged. And the things that people are being given and exposed to are highly problematic and creating issues. It's like in Layne's world, it's like none of that exists.
No, it's all the individual's fault.
Yeah.
And just to tag on, so talking about the implicit bias in research, sometimes it's really obvious. Another example where we saw it really clearly is in the calorie restriction hormesis studies. There's that one in apes where they have one group that's eating a fully processed diet. They induce calorie restriction, and the calorie restriction group has benefits. They have another group that's on a good whole foods diet. They induce calorie restriction, and there's no benefit. And the conclusion that they have to come to is that there was so much of a hormetic effect from the whole foods, the polyphenols and everything, that the added calorie restriction didn't add enough more hormesis, or it wasn't enough to create more of a difference. And so they were already got the maximal hormetic effect. It's like, that is insane to come to that conclusion, but it's so inherently built in. And as you were saying, it's not like a researcher would go into this trial saying, I know seed oils have to be good. So that is my mode. That is my goal here, is to come out the other end of the trial, take that cash from the seed oil industry and show that they're beneficial. Like, we're not saying that that's how it is. These are implicit in the textbooks. These are I mean, how many doctors do you talk with who are like, yeah, I was so fearful about prescribing T3. I mean, I've talked to a couple doctors recently about this, where they're like, if you look at what they tell you as a doctor about T3, like you are so fearful of prescribing it. And I've started to learn about it. I've understood the physiology better. I started prescribing it to my patients in a proper way, and they're doing so much better. I mean, this is part of the problem with just using the RCTs and whatnot. I mean, it's the same idea as just following that information of don't prescribe T3, because the only time someone's going to be low in T3 is if they're in a hospital bed because they're, in such
low T3 syndrome,
right,
from critical illness. Yeah,
exactly. Like, they're in such a diseased state. Like, that is what you get to, is that idea. That is the product of the same concept that Layne's putting forth. And it's really damaging. So that was one thing I wanted to mention. There's two other things that I want to mention. So one is, again, if we just look at lipid peroxidation, there's animal trials, there's mechanistic data, there's human trials showing increased lipid peroxidation with the increased consumption of polyunsaturated fats. You then see increased lipid peroxidation of these polyunsaturated fats in every disease process. When you have higher amounts of these lipid peroxides, it happens in Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, fatty liver disease, diabetes, heart disease. It's in the plaques. Like, it's everywhere. You see it, but you're not allowed to connect those things because there's not a randomized controlled trial.
Jay.
Right.
They're not in humans.
That show that exact effect. And then you're just leaving yourself a product of the inherent bias, among other things. But like, that's just a huge, like, you're leaving yourself as the doctor who thinks that the only person who needs T3 is laying in a hospital bed because of their low T3. And it's dangerous. It's awful. The other thing I want to say here is his whole argument is that seed oils are only bad because they're calorie dense, and they're no more calorie dense than any other fat source. They're all equivalently calorie dense. So again, big picture epidemiology, one thing a lot of people will point to is there's been this massive shift toward polyunsaturated fats in the diet over the last decades, several decades, 5, 6, 7 decades, where you're then seeing massive increases in chronic disease. Of course, you can't draw a direct conclusion there. You then have to also corroborate that with the mechanistic data and animal studies and human studies and everything. But I think that is, at the very least, a cause for concern. And I think that, again, you're totally discounting that. As you were saying, Mike, you're totally blaming the individual and taking any blame away from the actual quality of the food and the shifts that are happening around us that we have very little control over. And again, you're taking that power away from people to actually improve their health, other than just forcing constant restriction for their entire lives. Yeah.
It's removing agency to some extent, right? Because it's all about calories. And when many people, we were bombarded with the idea of calories so much, and many people will go and adjust their caloric intakes, and maybe they'll lose weight or something first couple times, but then it doesn't solve the other problems that they're dealing with. It doesn't explain, if you have serious digestive issues, calories don't explain FODMAPs. They don't explain irritation of certain foods in the intestine. The calorie is not going to tell you anything about that. So God forbid you have a digestive issue and you have a bunch of foods that you have problems with. Well, it's just because you're eating too much.
Yeah, dude, what does digestive issues have to do with health? I haven't seen any human RCTs on that.
Yeah. The other thing with this type of ideas, or the calorie idea overall, is like, it is kind of a distraction or almost an apology for what's going on with the food supply and like the food industry and how things are being promoted and whatnot. And I think that is a huge issue. That is like a really big issue, like distracts from that. And it puts things on a value that doesn't can calories be helpful to know? Yes. But it's like, perhaps that's one tool in a vast toolbox of nutrition things that you have at your disposal. And so to just hone down in on that and not start to look at these other tools you have available, I think is a mistake. And I think that people won't get the outcomes that they want if they limit the resources that they have at their disposal. Now, it's not to say that some things that people will harp on or that focus on heavily are probably not going to be that helpful overall. That is 100% true. You can try to use a tool that doesn't really get the job done for what you need to get done. But I think seed oils and polyunsaturated fat intake is one of those tools, adjusting your fatty acid profile. The amount of polyunsaturated fats you take in is actually one of the big tools that we have at our disposal to help minimize some of these problems. The last thing I want to say here too is that there are some studies looking at caloric consumption over time. And if anything, I don't see like a drastic change in caloric consumption from 2000s from the early 1900s. And there's studies looking at these things, like they'll break down what caloric intake is for different groups. So to just post it as a caloric problem, like we need to see the RCTs on that as well. I just want to leave it there.
Well, Mike, 10 extra calories a day is all it takes, right? 10 extra calories a day, 10 years, that's 10 pounds. Think about that. 40 years, you've gained 40 pounds. So I think even if you just see, an increase in 10 calories, that could be the whole problem.
All right, that's it. You got it.
If you enjoyed that clip, you'll definitely want to download the free Energy Balance Food Guide. The Energy Balance Food Guide will help you determine exactly what to eat to optimally support your metabolism and help you lose weight, improve your digestion, get amazing sleep, boost your energy, and so much more. The food guide makes it extremely easy to get started with a bioenergetic approach to optimizing your health. So head over to jfeldmanwellness.com/guide to download your free Energy Balance Food Guide.